Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Unpolished Podcast. This is Jon Sherwood. Thanks for joining us. I've got with me today James and Daniella Hatfield, part of the core leadership team here at the Asheville Church Network. Thank you guys for being here.
Oh yeah, we're excited to be here.
So, we're going to actually jump into the conversation today where we discuss some of the pros and cons of decentralizing church. What it looks like to decentralize and go into this kind of what we call a microchurch network, kind of this house church interdependent network of smaller groups, and what it looks like to decentralize, what we've learned, what we love, some things that we love a little less, and be able to share here with the audience. So thanks again for joining us. So maybe I can start off just by asking a really simple question, which is, again, for those listeners out there that haven't heard the episodes before this, we transitioned from a what we call kind of a traditional model church where we meet every Sunday. There's a large gathering, there's a sermon, and there's worship music, and there's a stage, etc. And 90% of people, 90% of the time, are basically just spectating. They're just observing, and very little sort of meaningful participation. So from that model, about probably 5-ish years ago, we started to transition into this microchurch model where we're meeting in smaller churches, and we're meeting in homes. And these churches are led by what we call microchurch pastors, who are not vocationally supported to do the work of the ministry, but they are leading their home churches. And it's a much higher degree of participation. And so we're going to talk a little bit today about some of the pros and cons of that decentralizing process. And I think in particular, some of the pros and cons as it is envisaged by the leadership of that network, right? You guys and us. And in coming episodes, I'm really excited. We're going to actually kind of take a view from the pew, if you will, which obviously is not the right verbiage anymore. It's going to be the view from the home, view from the park, view from the car. I don't know, but we're going to get some feedback and discussion and conversations with some people who have also gone through this decentralization and this transition, but have not necessarily been a part of the leadership of that decentralization. But today, what is it as a leader that you have experienced as we've decentralized church? Just kind of off the cuff, like what are some of the highlights, some of the things that just really rise to the surface more than others for you?
Yeah, well, I was thinking about it as we were preparing to discuss this today, and this is maybe more philosophical than what you're asking, but I was thinking, well, how would I even define decentralization? What are we even talking about? And so really big picture, it just made me think of several different times in the Bible, like from the very beginning when God sent his creation out to go forth and multiply and fill the earth. But then later he gathered them back together around a tabernacle, or when Jesus sent his disciples out, but then they came back to report back to him what they'd done. And so that got me thinking, okay, so decentralization is not, okay, let's go out and just always be moving apart from each other. There's still a center and a center of gravity. So then what's that? Um, and so, we spent all last year actually discussing that as a church, that Jesus is the center and of all these different areas of our lives. And what does that, how do we live that out? So those were a lot of the really high level philosophical thoughts that popped in my head at first.
So decentralizing is not the same as just autonomy, but it is a movement, almost like a reverberation, almost like out and back in towards the center of gravity, out and back in towards the center of gravity. And that center of gravity, I think the way I might comment on that is that center of gravity has shifted a bit to where we're trying to intentionally make the center of gravity the person of Jesus and the power of the Holy Spirit, as opposed to the center of gravity being our place of worship, our gathering location, our ecclesiology, and way that we practice our gatherings. And no one would say they want their center of gravity to be a building or a location or a particular way of doing church. But I think in reality, for so many of us, that does kind of become what it is that we are gathering around, what it is that pulls us together. So talk about that for a minute. Like, how have you seen, what impact has making Jesus the center of gravity had, as opposed to a building, an address on a map, etc.?
Well, I think when you're in a larger church expression, you know, you're we're all coming collectively to sing a big song, right? And that has an awe to it, right? When you're there with a huge group, there's an awe to it. And also, when you're sitting there consuming a lesson, you got your head down in the Bible, but you're not interacting. You're ingesting at that time. So I'm pouring out with a big group and ingesting really, and then quickly saying, "Hey, nice to see you. How's your day? How's nice?" You see all the sheep, right? You just kind of pat them on the head, and you're like, all right, they're all there, but you're not going like deeper. When you come into the smaller expression, especially more in that as a shepherd role, you're going deeper with fewer folks. So you get to know, I keep using the sheep analogy, those sheep even better than you would because there's that interactivity. There's listening and giving, listening and giving. It's um instead of the 80-20 rule, now you got 80% of that microchurch really giving and pouring out. So I'm getting a better view and window into the lives of a smaller portion of our network. So that comes with an inherence of like Jesus. I'm getting more of a look into the relationship of Jesus at a deeper level with just a small group of those sheep.
So how do you manage the tension then of not being able to have eyes on intersections with and proximity to more of the people that are within the purview of how we're expressing church?
So this is I always have the phrase, "Leave room for Jesus," right? You gotta
Mhm.
let him be Lord, right? You gotta step back. It's letting go, but there's some beautiful things that happen because as you work through the other microchurch pastors, you're training, we spend more of our time coaching now than anything else, even less time up at the pulpit, more time, down with the pastors and equipping them so as they get in those small groups, drawing out, asking those questions, and you got to trust God to work through those pastors to go deeper with the sheep in that
Mhm.
huddle, right? So I think I have less touch, but I have a higher touch with fewer folks. So I don't know if I think I'm getting a better window actually in the weirdest of ways. You think if you could see everyone, you'd have I think you get a surface level. And now I'm going a layer deeper and getting an even better understanding. Maybe we need to work in this area of this part of our relationships with God.
Yeah, I think you're striking at the heart, and I totally agree with what you're saying. One practical thing that we've done as a leadership team to, in some small way, address this tension is we did set up sort of a schedule of traveling around. So we have our home base microchurch that we're committed to 95% of the time, but there'll be occasional gatherings where we choose to go visit another microchurch. Just as shepherds, we do feel that responsibility for the flock. And, we can't just abdicate that, like, well, I don't know what's going on in that microchurch. And so we try to have those touch points, both for ourselves to lay eyes and just get a sense of how that microchurch is doing. And then for those folks to be able to see us, if they have a question or a concern, that they would feel that they have that kind of easy access where they don't feel like, well, I haven't seen you in months. So
Yeah, I think for me personally, um, the decentralization has had both a pro and a con at the same time in the same way. And that is around the idea of like knowledge, awareness. And so, on one hand, like you just said, Daniela, it's challenging me. It's been a con to recognize that I have less awareness of as many people. But the pro has been how much that has revealed in me how challenging that is and why. That it is hard to leave room for Jesus, right, James? Like, and the decentralization, I think, really puts a lot of pressure on that point, on that pain point of letting go, trusting God. And what for me personally I've realized is that this more traditional expression actually didn't put pressure on that nearly as much. Like I could see the kind of the whole church every week. I had much more like what I would call general like influence over the whole much more consistently, and how much like security I got from that intrinsically without even realizing it until you took it away, until it shifted, until it moved to something different. I was like, whoa, like, and it really challenged me to go, well, wait, whose church is this? Like, who's really in control? Who really has the power? Who's really moving hearts and convicting people of sin? Well, Jesus in the Gospel of John said it was the Holy Spirit, but man, the systems that I was working in, it often subconsciously felt like it was me. You know, if I'm doing this, I'm moving the church this way, and if I'm not doing that, I'm not moving the church over here. And like, and there is a legitimate, I think, even theological tension there of partnering with God, right? Like you brought up, Daniela, just this partnership and this reigning with God that's indicative in the first pages of the Bible, in the Genesis creation account, all the way through to the end of Revelation, right? Where we are reinstated in its complete sense to be co-heirs and co-creators along with God in this new creation. And so there is this tension there of like, we are responsible, and we do labor with God, but there are also things that we simply don't have power over and are not in control of. And I think for me, the decentralization has really highlighted that and surfaced that. So it's been both beautiful and I think formative for me to become more and more transformed in the image of Jesus, where I'm trusting God, and also has provided me to be like the good shepherd in some important ways, where I can not just in a general way, but in really deep, meaningful, like you said, James, just the personal touches, the anecdotal evidences that we're able to have when we're living in such closer proximity with people and their faith on an ongoing basis. So as we think about, there's this kind of, I think there's this very attractive persona of house church and small church that's like counter the big church. And that persona has to do with the idea of authenticity, genuineness, realness, right? However you want to call it. This like attractiveness to something that's not perceived as commercialized, as fake, as polished, right? And kind of the undergirding of this podcast, right, is that it's unpolished. So let's talk about that for a minute. As we decentralize, right, as we get smaller, there can be this common sense of it's going to be more authentic. It's going to be more genuine. It's going to be more real. So, is it?
I mean, we've been doing it for 4 years, and at the end of last year, we joined our smallest micro church. When we came, if you didn't include the kiddos, which we do like to include, but just for a second, I'll not include them just to give a visual for everybody. There was 9 of us. 9. 9 people sitting in the park, looking at each other like, "Oh my." Like, this is us, and Danielle and I weren't leading that micro church. We were actually just there to support the other pastors that are leading the church, and so if we weren't there, there'd be 7, okay? And so when you get to that point, you feel vulnerable, right?
Mm.
Because, you know, everyone needs to participate, or this is gonna be a very short time together. Are we gonna be looking at each other for a while? So you're life on life, and you address that first, like, "Hey, guys, we're small," but we had a hope and a vision, like, "God, like, use our little, expression of church here." And what was unique about this micro church is all of the folks in it were in neighborhoods. We had neighborhoods. We're like, "Oh, this is unique," because some of the other churches here in where we're located in Western North Carolina, neighborhoods aren't as common. You can kinda find your space on the mountain. But we're in these neighborhoods and we're like, man, let's see what we can do here. And God has done incredible things. And in the last, I mean, we've only been in this micro church for 4 months. The last one we were with or for 2 years. But this one now, God has added 3 new people. They've come and instant, we instantly feel their presence, and
Mm.
there's nowhere to hide. And the courage it takes, I think, even for those folks to come out to our little micro church in someone's home. Can you imagine walking into someone's home and there's like 8, 9 people in there and it's your first time joining? But
You're
it
gonna naturally think like this is so weird. And so the safety in numbers thing, sorry to interrupt, James, but maybe talk about that for a minute. Like the 3 people that have come, especially from the outsider's perspective, right? Who are just kind of walking in. Maybe they've had experience with house churches before. Probably most people haven't. There's no safety in numbers. There's no like, oh, clearly this must be a good thing because 1,000 people are here. So I can feel confident that this isn't some wahoo thing. All of that is gone, like poof in an instant. Talk about that. Like how do they how do they assimilate into this very vulnerable, perhaps very insecure setting? And what have you done? What have you seen other pastors do to kind of help with that transition?
Well, sometimes I don't assimilate. Like, we'll have people one and we didn't see them again. So who knows? We don't always know what's going on. But the folks that are staying, right? They come in and what we have to give, like we're all singing a song, all 9 of us, and it's either going to be heartfelt, it's going to be on harmony or not. Doesn't really matter. But we give our heart and then we share our lives. And then we share scriptures and then we pray and then we reflect. We have time to do things because we're not on a schedule. Like we're singing this song, this person does the announcements, this song. We're doing like there's no time for you're on schedule, right? And here it's like, well, Holy Spirit, what do you want to do? And I
Mm,
think people get to feel that, like the beauty of vulnerability, the beauty of the unpolished nature of it, the beauty is in the the authenticity. And you can try to fake it too. I mean, that'd be front and center too. But I think we have really pushed hard just to be our transparent selves before God, and we've seen amazing things. What do you think, sweetheart?
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right. It's not across the board. Not every soul in the universe will walk into a living room and just feel comfortable in a vulnerable setting like that. But certainly for some people, I think the vulnerability that we're already trying to practice invites a vulnerable response. And I have seen, again, anecdotally, like you said, but in my experience, it's been incredible just to see people on their first, second, third time just crying and pouring out their hearts. And, you know,
mm,
we had a family join us for a while. They since moved back to their home state, but um the the gentleman, after they'd been with us for a few months, he said, we were at a different church for like 10 years or a long time. And he's like, I feel closer to y'all in 4 months than I did to anybody in this church I was part of for 10 years. And it's because we're actually talking about real things and sharing our lives. And and so yeah, experientially I've seen that happen, um, both for us and for some new people.
and let me interrupt real quick, Danielle, because you mentioned, like, the guy said, "Oh, because we're talking about real things and we're sharing our lives." And, like, immediately I'm going, "Well, no big church pastor is ever gonna say, 'We don't want you guys talking about real life. We don't want you sharing your lives.'" Like, of course, no one's gonna say that, right? Like, everybody wants to talk about real things and everybody wants to share life. And so I want to clarify that, right? So that people are hearing you and us correctly, that we're not saying, oh, like, like for instance, this person that said, well, I feel closer to you guys in 4 months than this other church and other group of people than in 10 years. It's not because our goals are different. Right. I would imagine, I feel very confident saying the goals of that big church in regards to intimacy, relational connection, meaningful, deep relationships, our goals are the same. But I think, again, coming back to the pros and cons of the decentralization, there are some cons in the big church environment that don't, they're not only not conducive for those things to happen, but they're active hurdles for them to happen because you're sitting shoulder to shoulder watching the same thing, but not able to really have the opportunity to connect, to dialogue, to sit and cry, right? Like, but the smaller expression is kind of like trying to remove the stage, right? If you think about a movie theater, it's the difference between like people watching a movie together. I don't know that I've actually thought of this analogy till just now, but like how close do you feel to the other roughly 150 people that you watch a movie with? That movie could be riveting. You could cry during the movie. You could laugh your heart out. But when you leave that theater, the lights turn on. How close do you feel to the other people that you maybe were within 12 inches of? Zero, because the experience didn't allow you to connect. And I think that that's what I'm hearing you say. And what this guy maybe experienced in 4 months is that when he walks into quote unquote church, the screen is removed. And now all the seats are pointed not at the same screen, shoulder to shoulder, but now they're pointed at each other face to face. And it's a completely different experience. So, talk about some of the cons that you've seen when you turn people face to face. Like you mentioned, not every soul in the universe is going to be able to walk into church and sit face to face. Like that is like think about if you paid for a movie ticket and you walked in and there was no screen and everybody just was facing each other and they said, "Okay, the movie is for you guys to interact." You'd be like, check please, I want a refund." You know what I mean? Talk about the cons for a minute. Like, what are some of the hurdles that you've found, that you've seen, that you've experienced in this decentralization?
So one con is when you're so small, even if one family doesn't come, you feel it. Like it really feel it. And so we got to participate. We got to contribute. We got to give. Like you might be coming in, to the church feeling like I had a rough morning or a rough week and I don't want to talk to nobody. Well, there's no way to just sit back and eat. You could do that in a macro. You can't really do that. I mean, you can do a little bit of it. I mean, I think even at the smallest, you can check out the building and like check out and be like, I'm not really here right now. But you do feel that, right? And you can the vulnerability is great, but also, woo, here it is, front and center. So also, I think it requires definitely those microchurch pastors to coordinate more. Like they're coordinating every week. What house are we going to do, and who's going to do this thing? And like you're on every
Yeah.
week, so there's no breaks sometimes. And so I think there's a little bit of we have to be very mindful with what we ask our microchurch pastors to do and really not do. Like, guys, don't worry about this, don't worry about this, just focus on this piece, right? And really helping them. So I think that's also in some ways a con. And then I mean, every microchurch has different talents, right? Some microchurches you'll have a few gifted musicians, and man, the singing's so intimate and great. Others are like, we're playing a radio and we're gonna sing along to the tracks like karaoke. And that's what they do. And that's what they do.
Mhm.
And you're not gonna get that big band, like big I mean, it draws you out. Like when you're around great music, like you get a feeling from that. And if this is unpolished music and you're singing along to the radio, I think for some of us, we would have a challenge with that, right? There'd be some real struggle. So there's a lot of little pieces that can be into some of the non-advantages. But again, that's back to the unpolished piece. Like you just embrace what we are. We are who we are, and God, you give us the talents, and we got 10 talents or we got one talent, but let's not bury them.
There's a question that's kind of bubbling up, but I want to push pause on it, Daniela, to let you respond to the previous one before I continue this thread.
Yeah, sure. So, as we've pulse checked off and on over the last 4 years, both in sort of formal surveys and also just one-on-one conversations, it seems that the biggest drawback people feel is that loss of relationship. They feel the great deep relationships within their microchurch, but because we used to always meet together in a big group, people really miss seeing folks who are now in other microchurches. And that over and over and over has been the main thing that people express a loss or regret about. And we've felt it ourselves. Oh, go
And
ahead.
that's only unique for us who transitioned a big church or a traditional church into this. But people who've come into the micro church since that time, they don't experience that, right? Because they're not coming from, having been in a different expression with the same group of people.
Now, that said, we have multiplied. We started with 3 microchurches and now we're up to 5 and soon to be 6. When you multiply, you're gonna feel it. So
Mm,
maybe you come in for the first time, that's the microchurch when that multiplication happens, and you might even feel it even deeper because you were so intimate with that group.
mm,
So you gotta prepare for both ways. If you're in a macro and you're gonna decentralize, or if you start off micro, or maybe you start doing something during the week, maybe it's like, "Hey, I'm part of a macro church, I don't think they're gonna we're really going to decentralize, but I want to experience some of the things you guys are experiencing. You may start some of these small groups and then experience this when you start to multiply your small groups.
Well, and for us, obviously, the micro church concept is really undergirded by mission, right? We define our micro churches with two goals: mission and maturity. Maturity being defined as that center of gravity of Jesus, becoming more and more like Jesus, transforming into Jesus likeness, and mission, which is to help other people to be pulled towards that center of gravity. And what we've tried to do is to really embed a culture of multiplication is a great thing. It's an extremely positive thing, even though there are some relational costs, right? Like we may have greater distance with relationships that we would like proximity to, but all of this is framed in the conviction that multiplication, mission, the spreading and movement of the kingdom of Jesus is a great thing, and we want to be a part of that. The goal of microchurch is not just to find my small little intimate group of friends that I can just be around until Jesus calls me home. Right? That's a microchurch that's very stagnant and static and not on mission or movement, and that's very counter to how we have approached this. And so when you think about microchurch or house churches or small expressions of church being on mission, what are some of the pros and cons that you've seen of how they can be effective in mission in ways that maybe larger expressions cannot? And what are some of the cons to being effective in the mission of Jesus?
So I envision it like boats, like if we were on a big cruise ship, how long is it going to take to turn that cruise ship, to the left or right? I mean, look out. It's going to be a minute, you better prepare for it. And now when you're in the micro expression, you're in a little dinghy. I mean, you like zigzag, like that didn't work. Let's zig over here. Let's try this. We can take our micro church anywhere. Our micro church can be anywhere. We're not bound. We have no bounds. Like we can meet in this park, we can meet in that park, we can meet in that home. We could all go and serve at this community. We could, go and do stuff together, go around community. We could break up and do a women's event and a little men's event and then both family events. And I think being in a little dinghy makes us the ability to move quick, to meet those needs quick. Now we have less hands and feet wherever we go, but that's been I think pretty great. And when we're on mission, we can just, oh, there's a need, let's go, boom, let's go as a church, boom. It's only like 9 of us, so it's easier to coordinate. What do you think?
Yeah. I think the pros and cons just depend on who you are, if, because if I'm someone out in the community and I'm like, man, I really should find God. I should probably find a church. Like, what should I do? I'm going to hop on the internet, right? And look for what I think of as church, which is probably not microchurch. And so for people like that, it can either be just a non-starter, like, whoa, this sounds too weird, or just, yeah, it can be a very confusing entry point for people when they're expecting the sort of church experience that most Americans are used to. But for others, it's a great advantage, both for all the stuff James is saying, and just because there are some people who are jaded and like maybe have had a bad experience or whatever, something from their childhood where a sort of traditional church is not a comfortable place for them.
So that kind of leads me into the question that rose to the surface a few moments ago. This isn't really like what we are doing, but it's a thought that I've had, and I want to get y'all's thoughts about it. What if there's a big church out there, right? And like, we can kind of define those terms, whatever, 500 and above, 1,000 and above or something, like a big church, safety in numbers, like going to be the church that kind of draws the newcomers the most. If they're looking for a church, typically they're going to go to kind of the bigger ones in their area. Let's say that church either decides or maybe has a contingency of people already bubbling in it that want to experience or experiment with this smaller church expression, but not necessarily leave that big church. What thoughts come to your mind? What advice would you give for the pastor or the team of leaders at that big church to go, how could we do both? And how could we support? How could we equip? How could we resource people to experience and to live in these small church expressions while still somehow being a part of quote unquote us, um, without it having to be a divide of us and them, big and small, big versus small, big's better in these ways, small's better in these ways. Like, I'm trying to think like more of a hybrid. Like, how can Christians and leaders, especially church pastors, consider how to try to do both things simultaneously and meet different needs for different people at the same time?
So where we started was prayer and fasting for a year. God give us direction and get input, like get the church involved. Like, here's what we're going to be praying and fasting about. Let's hear, you got to hear from the sheep, you know, and you just listen to God's people, use your discernment. You're going to be in a tricky spot, I think, right? Because I think historically you're coming from a background where you got everybody together and now you've got maybe a handful of people here or there that are interested in doing a smaller group expression. So you're worried when you look out on a Sunday that those folks, especially if they're big time hands and feet in the church, and you're like, dang, those hands and feet are now going over into the neighborhood and they won't be there. And maybe it's some of those folks are like, man, we're gonna feel that, and I don't want that to happen. Or what if this, or what if that, or what if this? And so I think a lot of folks their first instinct will be like, no, 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 that's dividing the body. Like, let's not do that. Like, I think there'll be a big aversion. What does it mean also for this big building that we have a mortgage on and we've got salaries to pay and all of the things, scary thoughts that go through the head. And so I think a lot of it is just like, nope, not doing it. Right. And so I would say pray and fast and then talk to those folks that are interested in it. And potentially, if you get the gumption, you're like, all right, let's, I'm going to hold my nose and jump and plunge into this water. But I think it would be a great advantage, and it's my big prayer. I was talking about this to a couple folks the other day. Like, my big prayer is that a big, larger church would listen, or someone there, and they would say, you know what, let's step out on faith, see what God's doing here, because being able to push the God's body into the nooks and crannies. Because there's some people like that we've talked about it. Like, instead of bringing people to church, let's bring church to people. So, like, Matt, you're sending out these delegates, and we see what happened in the Bible. Jerusalem sending out to Antioch, and then brother comes back like, this is awesome. Come on, let's go spend a year here. And they learn so much from it. Is that you can start to get into all the nooks and crannies in the community by partnering with this. And who knows, like, you might actually be unshackling. You think God's like, oh, you think 1,000 people's a lot? Look what I got, and it's not even about the number. We like to judge success by the number, but like the most important thing is that if your sheep are telling you they are strongly desiring this type of expression so they can walk closer to Jesus, it's our responsibility as pastors to help people get close to Christ, because that, in my mind, is the success is are they walking towards Jesus? And it might look a little different and new and scary.
And that comes back to that center of gravity, right? The center of gravity really being about Jesus and people transforming more into his likeness rather than the center of gravity being about our expressions, our buildings, our little success metric, our little K kingdom, that it's so easy for that to happen. Daniela, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I think a big benefit of decentralization, a word that keeps popping in my mind, is being able to contextualize your microchurch. So we don't want cookie cutter like every microchurch needs to be like this, but like capitalize on the small dinginess of it and figure out your context. Like James just said, the microchurch we're in right now, pretty much everyone lives in a neighborhood. How can we leverage that? How would we operate differently because we live in neighborhoods than a different microchurch that maybe has more people in apartment complex or whatever, but figure out your context. So back to your question, John, if there were a large church and then maybe a subsection of people who were interested in experimenting with a microchurch expression, but still in unity or somehow co-partnership with the large, I mean, they'd have to work out how that works. But every place has little subpopulations and nooks and crannies and pockets of people who might never come to your big church, but like there may be an immigrant community or there may be, who knows, but could that microchurch somehow infiltrate a community like that and further God's kingdom in that way.
Yeah, you may have people that are driving an hour both ways to come, and they can't get a neighbor to come to save their life. They're like, no, I'm not hopping in that car for an hour there and back again. So they're good candidates. And if you can partner with a microchurch pastor, and maybe if you're a larger church, you might have some more resources. Like have one of your pastors be the coach, and they travel around. They're the voice for everyone. Like here's the great things going on. They can advocate, even to the macro. Here's the great thing, and then including those microchurches. Hey, every now and then we'd love to see you. Come to the larger celebration services. We would really welcome that. And the only other thing that came to mind, I just want to say this, and it doesn't have anything to do with the point I just made. But if you are listening to this and you're leading a large church, or you're pastoring a large church, or you're the person on the stage, we have to remember who this is about. Because as you get bigger, and maybe you're becoming more
Amen.
popular as a preacher, maybe you're putting books out, maybe you're getting a following, maybe you're like we can lose ourselves because we want the popularity. Remember, we're cool by association. The person we are who is our Lord, is Jesus. So we have to check ourselves. And as a leadership team, if you're listening to this, check, your church has gotten big. Why? And is there a humility to say, we put on a great show, or like we've got one of the best teacher preachers in the country, and that's bringing out tons of people. In fact, we've got him or her or whatever, like they're talking across tons of different screens on 5 different church buildings all at once, right? So just we got to check that. And if you're in that role, it's a very humbling. That's why these teachers are in such a humbling role, because we aren't supposed to be the popular ones. It's Jesus that we lift up on high. So I think a lot to chew on and wrestle on about that. And John, I mean, I may be striking on a couple of
You
things.
just said the words right out of my mouth, and I hesitate to regurgitate. I really want to though.
Well, add a little spice on top of it.
It's actually a great segue, because I'm actually going to have a guest on the podcast this next month, where we're going to be diving into the very thing you just said. He just wrote a book about these topics, but yeah, literally one of the last things I was thinking of saying here on this episode is kind of speaking to the people who are in my role and the role that I was in, leading a traditional church, right? And the church was never big by any means at that time, but it's harder the bigger it is. The more investments you have in things like real estate, buildings, the more entrenched and longer historically you've been doing things a certain way, it becomes the cruise ship. It takes a lot more time and effort and energy to turn it. And again, there's such a subtle, sometimes not so subtle, allure and real trap, I believe, of Satan, of hubris and pride, that when we are leading and we're at the top of something that we consider to be successful, it's just easy for it to go to our heads. And it's hard for our egos and our flesh and our sin nature sometimes to let that go, or to be willing to potentially jeopardize that. And I think, like you said earlier, James, that fear of like, well, what's going to happen? And, this successful thing that I've built, even if it's not, I mean, most people, like, obviously, most pastors are incredibly well-meaning and love Jesus, and they're trying their darndest to do the will of God. So I doubt very seriously that there are many pastors out there going, yeah, I'm going to intentionally build a kingdom for my own name's sake, and I'm going to rob God of all of his glory. Like, nobody's thinking that. That's no one's motive and intention. But just because we have good motives doesn't necessarily mean it's enough. And sometimes our hearts are very deceptive, even to ourselves. And so, yeah, I think like you said, of just really trying to be in touch with the movement of God and the Spirit of Jesus, listening to other people, listening to even other pastors that maybe lead groups and churches that aren't as quote unquote successful as yours, right? Like, we can have this confirmation bias of like, oh, well, that person leads a church way smaller than mine. Of course, I probably really can't learn anything from them, and these subtle ways that we become proud and obviously we don't have to convince people of how deadly pride is to a spiritual community and to our own hearts and lives spiritually. So, yeah, I think in regards to bigger churches and bigger leaderships and pastors, because again, like we've said from the beginning, I do think that there are some unique advantages to bigger expressions, right? They have more resources, they have the ability to impact change in larger ways. And yes, there are some certain cons too. We're never on this podcast trying to say that small churches are the only way to do something. But I do think that we can leverage the benefits of all kinds of expressions better when we are humble and when we are willing to learn from one another, when we are willing to let go and let Jesus really be the leader of the church. And so I'm excited to talk about this some more. We've got a guest that I'm bringing on next month to talk about his recent book called Desizing the Church, how church growth became an obsession and a science and what's next. And so we're going to have Carl Vaders here on the show here pretty soon. I'm excited about that, where we can kind of start to really explore some of these dynamics that make transitioning and decentralizing church so difficult in our context, not only for leadership, but even for people who are part of churches. And so, James and Daniela, thank you so much again for being here on the Unpolished podcast. And we look forward to just continuing to try to ride this ride with Jesus and allow him to pull us toward his center of gravity. Thank you, guys. We'll talk to you soon.